Imagine a royal baby, born into a world of silk and splendor. You picture a cherished heir, the future of a dynasty, protected at all costs. Their every cry is answered. Their every need is met. They are priceless. But what if I told you that in the cold, calculating world of medieval Europe, some of these royal children were anything but priceless? In fact, they had a very specific price. They were the most valuable assets in a kingdom's treasury, not for the gold they would inherit, but for the power they could be traded for. They were living, breathing contracts. Their currency wasn't gold or silver, but land, treaties, and the fragile promise of peace. This is the story of the darkest trade in European history, where royal babies were sold like property. To understand this world, you have to forget our modern ideas of childhood and romance. In the medieval era, a royal marriage wasn't about love. It was the ultimate political tool. A well-placed marriage could end a century of war, create a superpower, or secure a shaky claim to a throne. And the architects of these grand plans, the kings and emperors, were not willing to wait. They started the game early, incredibly early. The deals were struck in hushed tones in the back rooms of castles, while the subjects of the negotiation were still in their cradles, sometimes even before they were born. These betrothals were ironclad contracts, and to seal the deal, a down payment was often required. That down payment was the child themselves. They would be sent away from their families, their homes, and everything they knew, to be raised in the court of their future spouse. A foreign land, a foreign language, surrounded by strangers who saw them not as a child, but as a living symbol of an alliance. They were, in essence, a high-stakes royal hostage. Let's travel back to the year 1396. The brutal Hundred Years' War between England and France has been raging for generations. Both sides are exhausted. They need a truce, but neither side trusts the other. They need something more binding than a simple piece of paper. They need a human guarantee. And so, their eyes fell upon a 6-year-old girl. Her name was Isabella of Valois, the daughter of King Charles VI of France. She was, by all accounts, a beautiful and bright child. But her father and his advisors saw her as their greatest diplomatic weapon. The solution to their problem was to marry this little girl to the King of England, Richard II. There was just one issue. Richard was 29 years old, a grown man, a battle-hardened king. The age gap was staggering, even for the time. When the English envoys first saw her, they were concerned. How could a 6-year-old possibly be a queen? But when they met her, she handled herself with a poise far beyond her years. The deal was on. Imagine the scene, a lavish ceremony meant to bind two warring nations together. But at its center is a small child, likely confused, dressed in opulent robes that probably weighed more than she did. She was too young to understand the vows she was repeating, too young to comprehend the immense political weight that now rested on her tiny shoulders. She was being married off to a man more than 4 times her age, a stranger who ruled a rival kingdom. The ink on the marriage treaty was barely dry before Isabella was sent across the Channel to England. She left behind her family, her language, her home. She was now the Queen of England, but she was still a child who missed her mother and probably still played with dolls. Her new husband, King Richard, was said to have been kind to her. He treated her with respect, visiting her, talking with her, and giving her gifts. He saw her not as a wife in the physical sense, but as the embodiment of peace, a promise of a better future. But that future never came. Just 4 years after the wedding, Richard II was overthrown and imprisoned by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who would become King Henry IV. Richard died in captivity shortly after under mysterious circumstances. And just like that, at the age of 10, Queen Isabella was a widow. Her purpose in England was gone. The peace treaty she represented was shattered. The new king, Henry IV, saw her value. He wanted to marry her to his own son, the future Henry V, to maintain a connection to the French throne. But Isabella, this child who had been a pawn her entire life, did something remarkable. She refused. For 4 years, she resisted. She grieved for the husband she barely knew, and she rejected the new king's plans for her. She was no longer just a bargaining chip. She was a young woman with her own will. Finally, King Henry relented and allowed her to return to France. Her story, however, doesn't have a happy ending. She was married off again, this time to her cousin, and she died in childbirth at the young age of 19. She lived a short, tragic life, defined entirely by the political ambitions of powerful men. She was one of the first, and one of the most tragic examples of a child sold for a crown. But as brutal as Isabella's fate was, for some royal children, the chessboard was even larger, and the game never seemed to end. They were moved from square to square, promised to one prince, then another, their entire lives a series of broken engagements and new alliances. Perhaps no one exemplifies this better than Margaret of Austria. Born in 1480, she was the daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor. Before she could even form complete sentences, her destiny was already written. At the age of just 2, she was betrothed to the heir to the French throne, the Dauphin Charles. And so, Margaret was sent away to France to be raised as its future queen. She spent 10 years there. France was her home, French was her language. The French royal family was the only one she really knew. She was being molded, perfectly shaped, to one day wear the French crown. But in the world of royal politics, nothing is certain. When Margaret was 13, the political winds shifted. Her father, the emperor, made a new alliance. And her fiancé, the Dauphin, who was now King Charles VIII, found a more politically convenient bride. In a stunning act of betrayal, he repudiated his decade-long engagement to Margaret and married someone else. Imagine the humiliation, the confusion. After 10 years of being groomed for a single purpose, she was cast aside. She was sent back to her family's lands, a rejected princess. For many, this would have been the end of their story. But for Margaret, it was just the beginning. Her family wasn't done using her as a pawn. A new match was quickly arranged, this time even more prestigious. She was to marry Juan, the Prince of Asturias, the only son and heir of the legendary Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the monarchs who had funded Christopher Columbus. This marriage would unite the two most powerful dynasties in Europe. So, Margaret set sail for Spain. But her journey was met with a terrifying storm. The ship was tossed about by violent waves, and everyone on board was sure they were going to die. It was in this moment that Margaret showed her incredible character. Facing death, the 16-year-old princess calmly composed her own epitaph, a witty little rhyme, and tied it to her arm, so that if her body washed ashore, people would know who she was. It read, "Here lies Margaret, the gentle bride, twice married, but a maiden when she died." Thankfully, she survived. She made it to Spain and married Prince Juan. And for a brief moment, it seemed she had found happiness. By all accounts, their marriage was a loving one. But fate was cruel. Just 6 months after their wedding, her young husband fell ill and died. Margaret was pregnant at the time, but she later gave birth to a stillborn child. Once again, she was a widow, a pawn without a purpose. She eventually returned home, her political values seemingly spent. But Margaret had learned from her experiences. She had spent her life being moved around a chessboard by powerful men. She had watched, and she had learned the rules of the game better than anyone. In a stunning turn of events, her family appointed her as the governor of the Habsburg Netherlands. And later, she would serve as the guardian and advisor for her young nephew, the future Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. the pawn, had become a player. She became one of the most skilled and respected politicians of her age, negotiating treaties and governing with a firm and steady hand. Her life was a testament to survival, a story of a girl who was traded and rejected, but who ultimately refused to be broken. The stories of Isabella and Margaret are heartbreaking, but they were in many ways functioning parts of a brutal system. The machine of diplomacy churned on. But what happened when the machine pushed one of its pieces too far? What was the human cost when one of these living contracts finally broke under the immense pressure? For that, we must turn to the dark and tragic tale of Joanna de Castile, a woman who would become known to history as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad.
Joanna was Margaret of Austria's sister-in-law, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Her marriage was also a political masterstroke, arranged to contain the power of France. She was sent to the windswept lands of Flanders to marry Philip the Handsome, the Duke of Burgundy. Unlike many arranged royal marriages, theirs was said to be one of intense, fiery passion from the very beginning. They were both young, beautiful, and deeply attracted to one another. But their passion had a dark side. Philip was notoriously unfaithful, and Joanna was consumed by a powerful, possessive jealousy. Their life together was a whirlwind of intense love, followed by furious arguments and bitter reconciliations. Then, a series of unexpected deaths in her family suddenly made Joanna the heir to the vast kingdom of Castile. She was now one of the most powerful women in the world. And with that power came the vultures. Her husband Philip saw his wife's inheritance as his own prize. He began maneuvering to have her declared mentally incompetent so he could rule in her name. He spread rumors that her jealousy and emotional outbursts were signs of insanity, an instability inherited from her grandmother. He isolated her, controlled her, and used her emotional state against her. Then, in 1506, the unthinkable happened. Philip, still young and vibrant, suddenly died of a fever. Joanna's world shattered. Her grief was absolute, all-consuming. It was here that her story takes a truly macabre turn. She refused to let her husband's body be buried. For months, she traveled with his funeral cortege across the Spanish countryside, ordering the coffin to be opened every night so she could gaze upon his face. This haunting spectacle cemented the rumors of her madness in the public eye. Was she truly mad? Or was this the profound, despot grief of a woman who had lost the great, if tumultuous, love of her life? A woman who had been systematically betrayed and undermined by those closest to her? It's a question historians still debate. Her own father, Ferdinand, saw his opportunity. He sided with those claiming she was unfit to rule. He swept in, declared himself regent, and had his own daughter imprisoned in a dreary convent palace in Tordesillas. He claimed it was for her own good to protect her from herself, but in reality, he was seizing her crown. For the rest of her life, Joanna remained a prisoner. When her father died, her own son, Charles, came to power. He visited her, but he kept her imprisoned. She was the rightful Queen of Castile, but she was too valuable as a symbol and too dangerous as a ruler. For nearly 50 years, she was locked away, forgotten by the world, a queen in name only. Her passion, her grief, and her love were all twisted and used as weapons to strip her of her power, her freedom, and her identity. Her story is the ultimate cautionary tale of what could happen in this dark trade. She was the price of an alliance, and when her mind and heart broke under the strain, she was simply locked away, like a broken treasure.
Isabella, Margaret, Joanna. 3 women, 3 different fates, all bound by the same system. A system where a daughter's hand in marriage was the most powerful negotiating tool a king possessed.
They were sent to foreign lands as children to ensure treaties were honored. They were expected to produce heirs to solidify dynasties. Their personal feelings, their happiness, their very humanity were secondary to the needs of the state. Their cradles were bargaining chips, and their heartbeats were the ticking clock of diplomacy. They were born into gilded cages, surrounded by immense wealth and privilege, but with no control over their own destiny. They were the most powerful and yet the most powerless people in their kingdoms. Their lives serve as a chilling reminder that behind the grand tapestries of history, behind the epic battles and glorious coronations, there are deeply personal, often tragic, human stories. Stories of royal babies sold for power in the darkest, most personal trade of medieval Europe. If you found this story compelling, consider subscribing for more journeys into the forgotten corners of history.